Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll wait 1 or 2 minutes for people to enter, and then we'll begin. So if you just give us a few minutes to allow the room to fill. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a online workshop on good practices for implementing an intersectionality perspective in efforts to eliminate racial discrimination and protection of and to protect minorities. This is the second of 2 events today on intersectionality, racial discrimination, and the protection of minorities. The first one took place about an hour ago in the Human Rights Council, in which we had a very interesting session launching a guidance note on intersectionality, racial discrimination, and protection of minorities, a work that we've been undertaking as the network for the past year or so, in broad consultation with other UN agencies, hearing the voices of affected groups, including minority human rights defenders, indigenous human rights defenders, human rights defenders of African descent, and other affected groups. This work is done in the intersectionality pillar of the network on racial discrimination and protection of minorities. The network was set up in 2012 by the previous Secretary General, and the aim of the network is to provide a platform for UN agencies to come together to work on matters of racial discrimination, protection of minorities. As you're no doubt aware, there has been a quite vigorous coming together and around renewed energy to challenge racism, racial discrimination, and to strengthen protection of minorities. In particular, as a result of the events of 2020 and the global outpouring of solidarity related to the George Floyd killing, and of course, touching probably every part of the globe, as recognized in multiple world conferences against racism. Racism is a problem of all societies and engages our need to work vigorously to challenge and ultimately to end it. The intersectionality pillar of our network is coordinated by ILO, and it's been a very vigorous and positive set of work carried out under the leadership of Martin Olsen and his team, with our support. It is with their guidance and leadership here that we're convening the meeting today. The meeting today is to follow up on this launch of this guidance note that we published earlier today. And the idea of this session is to go more into detail on the practicalities of how to apply an intersectionality perspective and what the UN agencies can do in partnership with states, with civil society, with human rights defenders and others in order to advance knowledge and ultimately implementation of the ban on discrimination in all of its forms, including its intersectional ones. On our agenda today, we have Regina Pajares Carrillo. Regina is a senior minority fellow from Peru, based in Chile, and also legal director of the Office for the Defense of Rights and Intersectionality. She is the first of she's one of the first within our first stream of intersectionality fellows that we've placed in UN offices worldwide. She's one of 6 of the new fellows, and she's an Afro-Peruvian woman, an activist engaged in creating visibility around issues that women of African descent face in Chile and Peru. Our second speaker on the panel today is Rabia Anwer. She's Communication and Services Manager of the Employers Federation of Pakistan. She's here to discuss challenges and good practices implemented by private actors and employers to identify groups facing intersectional discrimination and to build diverse and inclusive workplaces. The third speaker is my colleague Chet Narayan Rasaili. Chet is a former senior minority fellow and current consultant for our office based in Nepal. He will discuss challenges and good practices for data collection and disaggregation at the country level based on the experience in Nepal. And finally, we have UN Women's Beatrice Duncan, who will discuss good practices by UN Women and the Intersectionality Resource Guide and Toolkit developed by UN Women and the United Nations Partnership on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and published around a year ago. And so it's now interesting to hear some of the conclusions and positive practice that's emerged from that. Following that, we will have discussion. The manager and moderator of our discussion today is Martin Oels. And I'll just say some brief notes around housekeeping. The attendees cannot use the chat, but only the question and answer box. So if you have a question, please post it in the question and answer box. You will not be also allowed to switch on your camera, but if you raise your hand, then you can be called upon and you can unmute. So for questions and answers, you can either post in the question and answer box, or you can raise your hand during the discussion and then you'll be given the floor. I just remind that, of course, as always, there's really one rule of these meetings, and that is respect. We've never seen any divergence from it, so it's simply a reminder that to be respectful and to listen and engage with interest in all of the speakers. I hand over to Martin Oels for the first discussion, which is on good practices for identifying those at risk of being left behind through an intersectionality perspective. Martin.
Thank you so much, Claude, and welcome to all the participants today in this second event on intersectionality in the context of the Human Rights Council session right now. It's really a great privilege and for all of us who have been involved in this to make this happen. This has been a collaborative process, as Claude has said, from the intersectionality pillar of the United Nations Network on Racial Discrimination. We had the intersectionality bill is a small task force that we are facilitating from the ILO, but it includes others. It includes UNICEF, UN Women, High Commissioner for Refugees, UNAIDS, and also UNFPA. So this is an excellent UN-wide, system-wide initiative, and this is now the opportunity for diving a bit deeper. Now we have this afternoon with us also two of the speakers from this morning session, at the Human Rights Council, and so this will be an opportunity to learn more from them, hear more from them, and then also to open up for discussions really about their experiences and what they can share with us as we move forward, not only in publishing a guidance note, but then thinking about how we can really rely on the guidance and how we can increasingly use and apply an intersectionality perspective in our efforts to eliminate racial discrimination and the protection of minorities. In this first panel, we are at the stage where we would like to explore more how this intersectionality lens would help us in assisting the groups, the individuals and the groups to which they belong, who are actually impacted by intersectional discrimination and where that facing structural and systemic, often systemic causes for exclusion and disadvantage, and that's often linked to their various dimensions of their identities rather than to one single personal characteristic that they may have. No? So the identification of people and groups affected by human rights violation is often the first step in addressing it. And so this, in that sense, the perspective will can sharpen us in the identification of those at risk of being left behind. And this is really how this links also together really nice the human rights agenda with the global agendas of the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, but other pressing global agendas that are inseparably linked from that, including the need for ensuring effective climate action. So in this first section, we will look at how this can help us to identify and recognize the groups, that we need to bring in, that we need to listen to also in devising the policies and that are meant to promote equality and to tackle discrimination. So what are, and this is very important because in every country, in every context, even within a particular country, we might be looking at quite different groups, so and this is something where we want to hear from all of you that are having experiences at the country level in very practical ways. So this is the sort of the rationale. Who are the groups that we're looking at, how we have identified them, and how we should go about in bringing them in and together with them actually taking some of the measures of redress. Our first panelist, and Claude has already mentioned the panelists for the first session, so there is no need for further introduction, but the first person that we would like to invite to address us and to share with us is Regina Pajares Carrillo. As Claude said, she is a senior OHCHR minority fellow. She has been doing a lot of work back home in Peru, but she's currently living in Chile also. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you. And thanks again coming all the way from Chile and to Geneva. We're really very pleased to have you. And I'm looking over to her because she's sitting in the same room than me with some other people. We're sitting in the Palais des Nations in Geneva together, and the floor is yours, Regina, for your remarks. Please go ahead. More or less 5 minutes, just as a reminder, not as a straitjacket.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. Okay, so for identifying the groups and good practices to put this guide in action, first we need to recognize that the role of intersectionality is not only to make visible the differences and the different grounds of discrimination, but create a systemic response against oppression. So therefore, we should always go beyond exposing the difference and implications of a case and start questioning how the system of oppression in a determined society generates this structure. So the first thing we need is to create data that makes visible the different grounds of discrimination. So it is necessary to develop tools that allows us to have a complete picture of the composition of the population. Indicators, for example, in places like Chile and in Peru are do not exist for people with African descent. There's only the national census, but for example, there are no disaggregated data regarding access to healthcare or other issues. So it is really a necessity to incorporate indicators that incorporate ancestry, national ethnic origin, mother tongues, languages habitually spoken, or other indicators of ethnic diversity. Numerical data and qualitative descriptions of the ethnic characteristics of people and also migrants should be generated obviously based on the principle of self-identification and collected and on a voluntary and anonymous basis. So, for example, in Latin America, it is a good practice to promote this development of indicators. What I usually did in my NGO was to try to look for statistics that had indicators, but I only found indicators regarding national origins and gender identification. So I try to work on that. And then, for example, in cases of people with African descent that are not recognized as people by Peruvian legislation, what I did is investigating the environmental impact analysis, the characterization of the population to help me know that we were talking about people with African descent and that they had not been consulted regarding an extractivist projects, for example. Other point that will help us to obtain information is work with civil society organizations from root-based civil society organizations. So for what I've learned in my job in the OHCHR in Chile is that there is a good a link between civil society organizations, and sometimes, for example, when we talk about migrants with African descent, what we do is make a panel of discussions with civil society to obtain the data, because they are collecting data. Since the state is not doing it, civil society organizations are doing it, and what we try to do is systematize those data to identify the problem and advocacy ways of implementing a human rights law. Also, another thing we need to do is to include people or minority groups that we are analyzing. We need to include them in the dialogues, and in because if we have an intersectional perspective, we should start by recognizing that people who are linked, likely to be discriminated, have agency of their own and can recognize and work to provide a response to racism and oppression. So also we need to do is to identify who is responsible, because, for example, in Chile, when we are following up certain recommendations from CER committees or other committees, what we have problems following up those recommendations and tackle discrimination, since they are too general and state does not make responsible to following up those issues. So also we need to involve people in decision making and governance to try to understand and shorten the gaps in access to human rights violations. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Regina, for your sharing from your experiences. And I think that you have highlighted the intersection that are quite important in your part of the world. We know we hear a lot about indigenous and tribal peoples from the region, but you have mentioned some other sort of identities that often overlap also, and they mentioned people of African descent. You've spoken also migration and about gender. So these are quite interesting intersections that you have also said need to be explored more through data, also through including people, through public dialogues, giving a voice to people, and by doing so also engaging actually with policymakers, so that the civil society really is also at the intersection between their advocacy and the public policy making. That's very interesting to retain. Thank you so much for that. We move on to our next speaker of this first panel, and this is Rabia Anwar. She is from Pakistan. She has been working with the Employers Federation of Pakistan. That is basically a federation bringing together employers organizations, that is the private sector, from all over the country. She works in Karachi, and she has been engaging in many issues, but also in promoting equality and on issues of discrimination. And so she comes from the context of the private sector, and in that sense, you're also in another other part of the world, and Regina is from the Asian context, and so we really look forward for hearing your analysis. How we can identify the groups that we need to look at, and how intersectionality can play a role in this regard. Over to you, Rabia.
Thank you very much, Martin. From a private perspective, first, I think as an employers, we need to understand that promoting inclusion, diversity, make policies, programs, equitable and responsible businesses are those that respects the needs, perspectives, and potential of their team members. So extending social protection and coverage to all, especially hardest hit by the pandemic, especially who are at the risk of being left behind and further marginalized, including women, young women, persons with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. So we need to ensure that we create such workplaces from which they can be benefited from a broad-based, job-rich, and gender-responsive recovery to leave no one behind. I hope that the outcome of this workshop would be to explore the opportunities that can arise from them. Firstly, for example, changing the perception and building an understanding of this intersectionality concept, because all identities are multiple and are built on multiple and overlapping categories. And often agencies of political and legal structures ignore that. That in which some cases, in negative cases, can lead to anti-discriminatory procedures and practices. So we need to change that. We really need to address that. Other perspective that we can look at is maintaining collaborations to disseminate this guideline and contextualizing it by doing a thorough gap analysis, because through that we will be able to set priorities for immediate action or remedy. And the two crucial instruments that Employers Federation of Pakistan thinks that's the heart of every work is creating awareness and the social dialogue, very crucial instruments. Another initiatives that we have taken, and I think it would be beneficial to share at this workshop as well, is the launching initiative to promote the benefits of a diverse workforce. We have drafted provisions with the companies and company policies and manuals on how to report discrimination and to deal with discrimination, especially the establishment of a grievance mechanism system, because anonymity and access to such mechanism is very important. We have also developed a code of conduct for protection from violence and harassment at home and at the workplace, especially for the domestic workers in Pakistan, because they are not usually considered in the world of work. Then working with governments and employers, working with governments and workers for the employers is very crucial. And the basic instruments that I mentioned is the social dialogue. And lastly, we have developed policies on gender equality and aging workforce as part of broader anti-discriminatory measures. So this guidance note will open opportunities and further advance our work. And most importantly, we'll be able to conduct a detailed analysis of the current practices and address the gaps for its effective implementation and development of our advocacy efforts. Lastly, I would like to end that every identity is unique and original in the sense that it has developed through personal experiences based on decisions we make. Similarly, the lived experiences of discrimination are also personal to that identity. So through this guidance and this workshop, we can truly understand our part in addressing the challenges posed by COVID, conflict, and climate, and finally work towards creating an inclusive, equitable societies and workplaces where our diversity is not tolerated but celebrated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabia, for that really perspective from your end, where you work. and from the part of the world that you work, you have really focused in on the contextualization also, so that this guidance note can, you know, be a starting point to look at home, how we can move forward. You have spoken about various intersections, age and gender, for instance, but you have also mentioned the health issue. So health is also ground of discrimination. And when we are looking also how the health crisis affects different groups, you know, from an intersectional perspective, I think this is very interesting, very specific, you know, suggestions about how to promote this at the workplace in terms of social dialogue, about instituting policies, but also grievance mechanisms, so that where people feel aggrieved, that there is a place to go and that this can be looked at, you know, so that people get also the support when they are experiencing the effects of discrimination. So this is very, very concrete. Thank you for those remarks. You know, the final thing, you know, that I really picked out is the domestic workers aspect that you've mentioned. Know that as employers, you are also conscientious that everybody is at work. Many people that are at work in the workplace have actually workers at home, and that there is a responsibility also for looking into their issues, into the protection of their rights. And we know, of course, that in many parts of the world, the domestic workers are, you know, usually, you know, in many cases, men and women, and predominantly women from disadvantaged communities that actually face intersectional discrimination in one form or the other. With this, thanks again, and we move to our next speaker, which is Chet Rasali from the High Commissioner's Office. I should say that I'm particularly pleased to see you on this panel, not only because we have to also look into the intersectionality aspects, you know, that also look at, you know, female and male issues. So it's good also to hear men speaking on this panel. And the other reason, and I think it's also fair to say that you have been also one of the masterminds in designing these events and supporting practically on many ways. And so it's in that sense that I'm very pleased also to give you the floor to share from your, not from your expertise on logistics and technicalities in setting up online webinars, but and also making a council event without any technical glitches, but from your experience, no, really as an expert and a fellow in the High Commissioner's Office, also to speak on the issue of data collection, disaggregation, and how this, you know, will actually also be needed to identify and to who are the groups we're talking about and what are the gaps that they're facing in terms of realization and enjoyment of human rights. So over to you, Chad.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, and I am really glad to be a part of this event and also part of this discussion as well. Without taking further delay, I just want to speak on the issues that I'll be stressing on. And as my co-panelists have already raised the important issues on intersectionality and about the community issues, I just want to share about my experiences on data collection and on data disaggregation in the context of Nepal. Unfortunately, in the context of Nepal, data, particularly in regards to the intersectional approach or from the marginalized approach, those are not that much available, and which I think is same with at global level as well, and similar to many countries as well. So, so for an example, we see that there are several data in our country on several issues. For an example, we have Human Development Report, but that Human Development Report actually speaks on several developmental aspects of the country that actually disaggregates the context of the province-wise. We have 7 provinces in Nepal, and you can see that which province is rich, which province is poorer than another. So we can find these all data, but it lacks in explaining that which community is poorer, or what is the context of their or what is the context of their social, economic, or other rights. So if you see that the context, those are really different than one another, but the developmental aspects that actually fails in addressing about the community issues. We have multi-dimensional poverty index in Nepal, that has been published by the National Planning Commission Nepal in partnership with UN agencies as well. But that also fails, identifying that which community is really poorer. That has actually, last year it has been published, and we can see that it has excellently shown that Nepal has decreased its poverty rate from 26% to 17%, but it actually lacks telling that which community or which particularly which community is actually under the lives under the below line of poverty. So these are the actual challenges we see. And so another example that I just want to give you is we have National Health Demographic Survey, which is actually fine in defining several health issues in Nepal. That also greatly defines the issues of gender-based violence against women and girls, but that also fails in addressing that which communities women face the most discrimination and violence. So that is what actually is the context of Nepal. And if we see, and what I have observed from several discussions, and mostly from the minority communities perspective, which is also civil rights perspective, the civil society perspective that I have observed from various discussions, is that there might be one challenges, that is resources. The state agencies or the government actors, they always tell that lack of resources, they are unable to have intersectional approach in data collection, which I think is one of the issues, but not the major one. Another thing is I think it remains because of the power structure, that who holds the power. If data comes from intersectional approach, then it actually can show that who is actually in the power and who are actually marginalized. And that can actually become a good advocacy tools for minorities and those who are actually facing discrimination. So that is why I think the intersectional approach is not that much, is not applied by the state agencies. At the same time, if the intersectional approach is being clear, and if it shows the clear picture that who are marginalized, then it will also show a demand that they will need a special treatment from the state. That's why the intersectional approach is not that much included in the context of in data collection and data disaggregation. That is widely been discussed and raised by the civil society communities in Nepal. With this, I just want to give some good examples as well. So we have one state of social inclusion in Nepal that has been published by the Tribhuvan University in Nepal, and that actually shows some intersectional approach. We have also one document that the UN agency in Nepal, the United Nations in Nepal, in collaboration with other agencies led by Resident Coordinator Office, has published one, Harmful Practices in Nepal, that actually shows that which community face this discrimination and what are the treatments. And these have actually helped a lot minority communities in Nepal to advocate in their right, advocate and to raise their issues in different platforms as well. So I think investment in data collection is highly important, and it should be prioritized by state agencies, including all the stakeholders. With this, I sum up my remarks right now here, and over to you, Martin. Thank you.
I really thank you, Jed, for zooming us in, at the country level from your experiences in Nepal, which is not only beautiful but a very diverse country. And so I really liked how you spoke about data not only being a technicality. It's not an issue that will be solved by statisticians only, but that data is powerful. Data is produced also according to social, political, cultural framing and expectations, and so that actually, this idea that we wait to have to data first to do something, I think this is, by what you said, it's not the way we should be going. We should be advancing both together. This idea of understanding why we need better data to identify who are those that are at risk of being left behind in the fullest sense, including in terms of participation in decision making, not only in socioeconomic terms, and that therein lies also the power of having this discourse in the data that we have in many countries, and including Nepal, data disaggregation, but maybe the what is being used for, what is made public or used for policy analysis is not, going that last mile of having also an intersectional analysis of this. There's many efforts in the UN system, as you have mentioned, including, the UN country teams that are, stepping up there. And this is actually very good to hear, because our initial objective with this guidance note was also to create more incentives for UN country teams and support for UN country teams to go about this and to assist stakeholders in the country to move forward on this issue of data. So thank you very much for really putting our eyes and our minds on the issue of data that will become only more important as more we get into this matter. Now, I'm very pleased to pass on the floor to Beatrice Duncan from UN Women. To many of you, she would not need any introduction. She has been a long-term fighter, I would say, for equality, gender equality, and intersectionality in the UN system. We know each other very well from the interagency support group on indigenous issues, and it's also good to see you again back in other networks, including this one. And it really, this is maybe also more intersectionality that we need to promote in the UN system, to look into these issues less in silos but across. So it's really great to have you on this panel. It's not by accident that we are keen to have you here to speak, because as we can also read in the guidance note, we try to reconnect to other initiatives in the UN system in intersectionality, and so we're talking all about the same intersectionality, but you can go from different entry points and you will reach very similar. So we need to go also hand in hand in promoting this. I will not reveal much more. You will be speaking about what UN Women has been doing very significantly, and we look forward to hearing from you. Beatrice, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks so much for the introduction, and hello, everyone. I'm actually going to be diverting a little bit to speaking more about the UN system, because many of us may be curious as to how the UN system as a whole identifies persons that have these multiple identities and therefore suffer various forms of discrimination. So as far as the UN is concerned, you may recall that during the era of the Millennium Development Goals, there was a serious struggle over how to identify issues of vulnerability. So therefore, the concept of the human rights-based approach to programming became very, very dominant in the early 90s. And in fact, it was through the same human rights-based approach that experts such as Nela Kabila was able to identify the weaknesses behind the MDGs. And therefore, during the debates around the 2030 agenda, it was the human rights-based approach that actually guided the discussions, which eventually resulted in the concept of the Leave No One Behind. So how does the UN system actually identify vulnerable groups, and especially those that have multiple forms of identity and therefore suffer various forms of discrimination? So from my experience at country level, it is very common for the UN country team every 4 years to undertake what is known as a common country assessment. And this common country assessment is done in close collaboration with experts such as those who are on the panel today. But more specifically, the civil society organizations, as well as the government counterparts. And one may ask, why the government counterparts? In actual fact, you will be very surprised to learn that the governments often do not use the term intersectionality, but actually do apply an intersectional lens in their own identification of vulnerable groups in their various national contexts. So upon a review of national development plans, and even a review of constitutions, one would find a serious effort by governments to identify specific groups which need specific types of help. So since we have colleagues, for example, from Nepal on the panel, I would like to give the example of the Nepalese constitution. The Nepalese constitution is very elaborate in terms of what the government needs to do to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of National, Ethnic, Religious Minorities. So there are articles in the Nepalese constitution on equality before the law, which constantly reminds the government on the need to address the needs of different forms of minority groups. This is the same in Singapore. It is the same in South Africa. And I need to state that at least 63 constitutions make reference to the need to address the needs of ethnic minorities. In some instances, it addresses the needs of religious minorities, in a few instances, sexual minorities. And at least 46 constitutions also embed the rights of indigenous populations. Why am I mentioning these references? It is very critical because in our own programming within the UN system and outside of the UN system, for us to actually go to the source of national commitments, and the Constitution can serve as that initial source. And I know that in the guidance note, the different identities that different people have around the world that often intersect to result in multiple forms of discrimination is really the center of discussion. But one thing that we need to realize is that intersectionality is dynamic. It can change over time. An example is during the COVID crisis. None of us can deny that the forms of intersectionality that existed before COVID has changed and has been intensified as a result of this global problem that we had. So what it means is that in our identification of individuals and groups that suffer multiple forms of discrimination, we need to realize that it is not a static situation, and that it is dynamic and can change over time. And this is why the common country assessment of UN country teams is often done not once every 4 years, but oftentimes after a midterm review, which requires the UN country teams to review their concept of intersectionality. So what I would like to leave behind in this discussion is the need for us to have a dynamic view of intersectionality, and for us to look at the various tools that include constitutions, as well as the multi-dimensional poverty index, for example, that allows us to look at intersectionality from different angles, and also gives us the tools as well as the remedies for us to address this issue head on at national level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for really pinning this also to the UN system, because as we said, the UN system has a mandate and an obligation and a responsibility to advance these issues in accordance with the standards that we ourselves have adopted as the UN. And so it's very important. I think that what I really would, as you sum up yourself, I like it really. You know, it's like there is one thing we shouldn't be too much concerned about the word intersectionality, because it might be complicated sometimes to explain. But if we see in a country there is a good basis to actually apply this thing, and we don't need to have everybody understand what the theory behind it is, but we can move forward, because actually this is something that is getting increasing recognition. As you said, in many national frameworks we have it. No, and then for the UN, how we move forward. And I think what you said is also very important, because we have a lot of civil society here with us. We are actually 58 people in the line here. From different types of civil society organizations, and so how the UN can also work with the civil society organizations that work in the different social fields, you know, from employment to health to rights to access to justice. So we need to make sure that we are open to those and bringing people to the table in moving these things forward. No, so this is really a very excellent reminder. With this, we come. This is the end of the speaking part of this first part of our workshop, and we have now the opportunity to engage. You know, so this means that the people that are in the line, the participants, can either put questions in the Q&A box that is open, and we will then bring these questions up, or you can also ask for the floor by raising your hand, which is the raise hand button, and then we would give you the floor from our technical back end to make sure that you can ask your questions to the panelists who are also now all on camera with us in our virtual workshop room. I'm looking at the Q&A box. There is no question for the moment. If there is anybody who wants to ask a question to the panelists, so this is can also be done by taking the microphone, and for that you need to raise your hand with the button and we would open your microphone. It appears we have a question, and in the box we have a question from Genoveva Satirova, and please take the floor. I think your microphone should be open by now.
Okay, hello, are you hear me?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear. Thanks so much. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Genoveva Satirova from Bulgaria. I'm Roma activist. I just have a small opinion about access paid to the Roma woman and to the Bulgarian woman, or to the minority woman and other people, in not only in Bulgaria, in all Europe. Like example, if Roma woman and some Bulgarian woman, like example, just their work, they have same work, same obligation, are there have equal chance to equal pay. My opinion and my experience, who I have like minority activists for human rights, because they haven't equal access for pay, for access to the business and etc. What you plan to change in this point? This is my humble opinion to everything what happened. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Genoveva, for the question. We have, I don't see any other hand up for the moment, so we would then I'll pass it back to the panel on this. I'm just capturing the questions or the experience in Bulgaria and maybe other countries in Europe where the Roma population is facing, you know, structural disadvantage, which often is compounded with gender, race, and other issues are compounded, which leads, of course, to outcomes, unequal outcomes in terms of here was the question of remuneration, access to economic opportunities. No, so I'm looking at the panelists. We have also somebody from the employer side here, is Rabia, and I think some of the issues that the Roma, you know, are facing in Europe is maybe, you know, from a structural point of view, quite similar than in other parts of the world, where you have a big group that is marginalized and excluded, you know, from education to access to health to employment. So I think we could look at Rabia maybe, and then also maybe to look at Beatrice. Maybe I could ask the two of you to react quickly to that. Either one is happy to go first if you want. Beatrice, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks so much, Mark. In fact, I very much agree with the comments. One thing that I have noticed in my experience with the UN is that when there are marginalized groups located in middle income countries, the urgency around addressing the issues in that part of the world tends to be a little different. But I think that with the creation of our network, we need to expand our lens and have a cultural shift because many of our UN agencies have offices in Eastern Europe. And this is a moment for us to reflect on the decade of action of the Roma community. Roma women have been so active, just as Indigenous women have been so active. But their visibility is a question that we need to reflect on this afternoon, because I do not think they have been given equal space, equal attention, and equal opportunities. So I would like to use this occasion to actually render an apology to the Roma community, because I do not think that they have been given that visibility. So this is our opportunity to begin to reflect on that issue and to avert our minds to the Roma Decade of Action, which comprehensively sets out a set of actions that all of us can use as entry points to bring about change within the Roma community. But the beginning first and foremost with making them visible and their issues visible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrice. And I'm looking at Rabia, whether she wants to jump in as well on this one.
Yes, thank you, Martin. I agree with the concern that you raised, and it's very similar in developing countries in Pakistan as well. I'll just start off by saying that changing the social norms and these unaddressed biases that are being faced by minorities and migrants, they are highly influenced by our cultural, socio-political stereotypes. Because of this topic of discrimination, equal rights for minorities and migrants is very sensitive and not easily taken in our country. And now the complexity of this intersectionality and its importance in adaptation is also very challenging. But I think what Beatrice just said, that we need to have that dialogue where we can talk about, create platforms where these real issues are discussed. So through this workshop, I think I'm hopeful that we'll be able to discuss this. Another thing I think that really impedes our discussion further in this topic are the anti-discriminatory laws that I also mentioned previously, because back in Pakistan, there are not many specific anti-discriminatory laws, but there are some practices and provisions that does promote indirectly. So we really need to work together, create a platform where we can have a social dialogue and work towards embedding these discrimination in the constitution and under general laws, so that we can create workplaces where they give equal access to everyone. I think that would be from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabia. I'm looking in the chat. There is quite an activity going on here. We have Carlos Castilla asking, with the intersectional perspective, how about making sure that human rights are universal and the same for everyone. I think this hints maybe, and maybe I speak a little, can speak to that question. I think this hints at the issue is like, first of all, like how the different groups relate to each other. It's like, how do we make sure that you are, that this is perceived as something that remains within the overall framework of human rights, in the sense that we're not sort of privileging maybe someone, looking maybe at some group more than the others. I think that this is a concern that comes very often, you know, when we have a group on specific focus on particular group. You know, why do we need to look at minorities, at indigenous peoples? Isn't that a privilege, actually, an extra of rights? And usually we are saying that, no, this is not additional rights or different human rights, but these are specific principles and values embedded in the international human rights regime that making sure that people that have faced structural and continue to face exclusion actually come at the same level and have the same rights to participate. So it's in that sense, I think the answer is that an intersectional perspective is actually helping to make sure that everyone benefits and is protected at the same level. So there is a question also from Abdul Karim Bajie, I hope I'm saying this right, and speaking about modern technologies, you know, how they can be used as tools for addressing racial discrimination at the national and global level. I think that's something I want to sort of keep there. You know, when we go in the next round, maybe you can, the panelists can speak to this as well. We have a very specific question from Angie, who was a fellow, minority fellow in 2009. Good to have you here. And there's a specific question to Beatrice about her opinion. How can national human rights institutions be strategic for this important work? So this is a very, you know, we're talking about national human rights institutions, national human rights commissions. There's sometimes different names, but what's their role? And there is a question from Alejandra, a colleague from the World Food Programme, to Rabia. She wanted to learn more about the grievance mechanisms that Rabia has talked about. You know, how that can this look like? What's the process? How we can make sure that people trust in this and that it also responds sort of to the diversity that people represent in terms of language, disability, different literacy levels, and so on. So I think let's deal with the technology question, cross-cutting. You know, whoever is be given the floor can talk about this. But I would start then with maybe Beatrice responding about the national human rights institutions, please.
Actually, if I could start with the technology one.
Great.
Yes, because you see, what we are realizing is that technology is now the gateway. It is the gateway to advancement, personal advancement, national advancement, global advancement. But what we are realizing is that 500 million women lack access to technology. It could be as simple as a mobile phone. And we realize the impact of this during the COVID crisis because many women who were experiencing multiple forms of discrimination were forced to use technology in order to access services because of social distancing, because of lockdowns. And this is why there was a spike in violence, a fourfold spike in violence during the COVID crisis, because women could not access services. So that's just one issue I want to park for our discussion. But in terms of the role of national human rights institutions, we cannot underestimate their power, their position, and their potency. At national level, we know that it is the national human rights institutions that actually lead the government delegations to the Human Rights Council. It is of course, in partnership with the Ministries of Justice, but it is the national human rights institutions that actually drive the development of reports to the various treaty bodies. So we need to be very closely aligned to the agendas of the national human rights institutions so that we can contribute to these reports. But not only contribute to the reports, but also develop our own national shadow reporting. And this is where civil society organizations play a tremendous role. And I salute civil society organizations for the roles that they play in preparing these shadow reports. But one thing I would say is that in preparing these reports, you must work in close collaboration with the national human rights institutions, because when you do that, the implementation of your recommendations become much more easier. And obviously, these recommendations feed into the final reports of the treaty bodies. Thank you.
Beatrice, since we have you on the line, there is another question for you. And it's kind of related, so I'm gonna pull that first, which is like a colleague is asking, in terms of the analysis to do in the United Nations country teams, you know, in terms of the data, the analysis, and the sort of the granularity are we talking about? So the question is about balancing, you know, it's like how we gonna go in all that granularity, trying to cover any and every intersectionality, while maybe we might be losing the big picture, you know, in terms of what are the great challenges, you know. So if there is the big interventions that need to take place and that we need to focus on, you know, is there a contradiction between these two things, or how should we maneuver this, you know, in terms of also keeping in mind sometimes how stretched we are as the UN?
Yeah. Yes, that is important. I think that in every common country assessment, we look at the bigger picture first. We look at the status of the nation, the governance situation, the political situation, the economic situation, the macroeconomic frameworks. We look at the budget, we look at everything. And it is based on the bigger picture that we are then able to identify the vulnerable groups. But I have to say that in identifying the vulnerable groups, in terms of what the UN system will do, there is a process of prioritization. So in partnership with the government and civil society groups, there is a process of prioritization. So specific groups are prioritized over others. But I wouldn't say that is a very good long-term solution, because what you find is that in the long term, other groups become even more vulnerable. And I'll give you an example. Mothers with children in prison, for example, are hardly given attention at all. In fact, the criminal justice sector, as far as it relates to people in conflict with the law, is hardly given attention. So I would say for civil society organizations, please be the sounding board for the UN system, because I don't think we get it right all the time. We depend on you to help us to avert our minds to the areas that matter most. And as I said in my presentation, the issue of intersectionality is dynamic. What is intersectional today may not be intersectional tomorrow.
Thank you so much. That was a question from Matteo concerning the CCA. So I think thanks for your reply. Now, let me move perhaps back to Alejandra's question about the grievance mechanisms and how that could look like. Perhaps Rabe is able to jump in again on this one.
Thank you, Martin, and Alejandra, thank you for the question. I think it's important that I first mention what a grievance mechanism is. So it's an internal procedure for complaints, followed by a proactive and preventive management response and feedback. And this is very important for businesses to establish these mechanisms that gives access to workers and women and other groups at the workplace that are victims to various forms of oppression and discrimination. And the two very important elements are access and confidentiality of the person, because there is a fear of losing job, and that prevents them to make such complaints or to speak out. So businesses need to ensure that they provide these platforms, have access to these platforms where they can come and under confidentiality share their experiences that they might be facing at the workplace and even back at home. EFP is creating, Employers Federation of Pakistan is creating awareness raising sessions and are literally helping the companies back in Pakistan in establishing these mechanisms, especially for the workers, including minorities and migrant workers, where they have access to such platform. To add a little context, I'll share an example. For example, Pakistan is an agri-based economy. So we actually worked, and the cotton supply chain is the biggest industry in Pakistan. So We have very traditional methods back in the urban communities where the landlords and farmers are. So we try to, through social dialogue, we try to establish a platform where families, the workers, their families and children who are the victims to these kinds of oppressions can come forward, share their issues. And through this platform of social dialogue, we have established an association where these issues can be discussed. So this is a very a huge landmark for EFP, for Pakistan, because as you know, agri-based economies, they are very traditional in their ways of work, and their families and communities are very much oppressed, as you can imagine. So this was a great example of establishing such platforms, and I hope that we continue this in other industries as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia, for this follow-up to your initial presentation, actually, and thanks for asking the question. We have Linda sharing, Linda Espinosa sharing about data again, saying that there is not enough granularity in the data. I think in Canada, she speaks about the gender pay gap that is mainly, seen as an issue, that is seen as like basically a gender gap that is affecting white women in Canada. And so is the UN making recommendations to countries to segregate data to address these problems that affect us not only personally, but generationally? And so that's a very important point to make. What's the impact of that intersectional discrimination for future generations? Maybe I can reply to this quickly as ILO. So this is key. There is the International Equal Pay Coalition that the ILO and some others are engaged in together with governments, workers, and employers. And we are trying actually to promote this idea that pay data needs to be disaggregated by more than gender. To make sure that we are all, because when it's done, we see exactly also like who is more affected and how this can be addressed. What is it? Is it equal pay legislation? Is it collective bargaining? What do we need to do to address some of the structural issues there? So this is an excellent point. And indeed, many of the UN bodies, make recommendations to do this data segregation on gender and other grounds according to the circumstances. But the gender, ethnicity, disability, health, age, I think these are becoming grounds more and more important. And even in the SDGs, in target 17.18, if I remember correctly, the UN system is called upon to assist states in actually putting in place the mechanisms to collect, disaggregate, and make available data on more than one ground, really. There is a comment, and I think we need to first of all, we need to close the speakers list, as they say in the council, and the reception of comments and questions for this panel. We are closing it now. We're just trying to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, maybe 3 minutes left. And we would also propose that we are not making a break.
We need to make a break.
Okay, I'm getting some reactions here in the room where I'm sitting. So we need to make a little break. There is a need for a technical break of 5 minutes that we do, but we are still kind of wrapping up because I wanted to ask still another question to Regina. Because we have someone writing us from Cameroon. This is Eric, and he says he's listening from Cameroon and very happy to be among us. And the indigenous peoples in Cameroon suffer from several problems, including non-participation in major decisions in their own country. In Cameroon, there is a process of decentralization going on, but indigenous peoples are spectators. And so there's a question of how we can make sure that we are not only recognizing indigenous peoples, but how we can also reflect on new measures for their development in which they can participate. I think this is something that is maybe a similar theme, on how we can also make sure that within these groups, all the different identities, come to the same table. Maybe you can just maybe give a little glimpse of that, how you see this, very briefly. Thanks. Thank you so much.
So I think that it depends on the states. Right now, we are working with state counterparts, as Beatrice mentioned, because when you unite NGOs and their counterparts, these dialogues make visible these issues. And as NGOs, as as human rights defenders, we need to make visible this and start asking why indigenous people are not in positions of power, why people with African descent are not in positions of power, but it's going to be a long-term work to make this possible, but we need to keep asking states to promote this. And I think the dialogues and webinars and start pushing through NGOs with states actually works. And actually with legislations to, for example, there are plans for developing people with African descent in Peru that mentions that people with African descent have to be a part of decision-making roles in states. So through legislation, we can make that change too.
Thank you so much, Regina. And with this, I'll conclude the panel. There is no point for summarizing because we have been listening carefully, and we have been taking stock as we went along. And we have also colleagues here that are taking notes actually of what we're discussing. So this was a very rich round. Thank you so much for the panelists, for your experience that you shared and the engagement with the questions, and to the very large audience of 56 people here that we have. And with this, I think we go into a technical break.
Yes,
of 5 minutes. I'll hand over to Claude, who will elaborate on that.
Yeah, we have 4 excellent speakers coming, but I think we should take a break and just do some breathing. So we would ask people to come back within 5 minutes, meaning we will restart promptly at 4:18, and hope not to go over too much from the second panel, but if we need to go over a little bit, I think it may be worth the discussion. So let's do some stretching, and then we'll come back at 4:18 promptly. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome back. Thank you to everyone who stayed on and those returning. We have an excellent panel coming, so I hope people will stay on. This second panel moves the question from identifying those at risk of being left behind through an intersectionality perspective to then the question of actually supporting those at risk of being left behind. The second discussion will focus on the following questions. How does an intersectionality perspective help advance tailored efforts, including policy, programming, legal development, project implementation, and other actions and programs to support those at risk of being left behind and their rights? It also examines the questions of what are some examples of good practices implemented by various actors and at different levels. Our speakers in this panel are Mina Varma, who's Executive Director of the International Dalit Solidarity Network, who will discuss positive examples for eliminating caste-based discrimination and other similar forms of discrimination based on work and descent, including through an intersectionality perspective. Then we have Ghada Al-Harazi from the UNICEF Country Office in Yemen, who will discuss community engagement intervention to empower the Muha Mashin communities in informal settlements in Yemen. Our colleague Anita Holterhoff from UNODC, from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, will present a joint project they run with UN Women to advance access to justice for women facing intersectional discrimination in Liberia, Senegal, and Sierra Leone. And then finally, we have Joshua Castellino, who is Executive Director of Minority Rights Group International, who will discuss a global approach to minority rights protection and good practices in implementing efforts through an intersectionality perspective in light of current challenges, including conflict, climate change, and other large global forces. We have until 5, or 4:55 formally to wrap up. I'm going to try and not let it get too much longer, but if we need to extend in the interest of a good discussion, I think we're not afraid to do so. So with that, I would give the floor first to Mina Varma, Executive Director of International Dalit Solidarity Network. Mina, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Claude, and thank you so much for inviting me to attend this along with so many prestigious other speakers. So obviously I'm the director of the International Dalit Solidarity Network, and I just wanted to start with discrimination based on work and descent really does remain a reality for millions of people worldwide, including an estimated 250 million people who suffer on the basis of caste discrimination. It is most often associated with and restricted more or less to the context of Dalits in South Asia. However, it is a much more global problem than that, affecting communities in Asia, Africa, Middle East, the Pacific, and in various diaspora communities in my own country, in the UK, for example, as well as the US. And Dalit women in particular suffer from multiple and intersectional forms of discrimination, including based on their caste, their gender, and their social status. DWD, discrimination based on work and descent communities, have been marginalized and stigmatized due to the inferior status assigned to them, and their discrimination so often just gets ignored or denied, and consequently they have been left out from legislative protection even in countries where non-discrimination clauses have otherwise been included into laws, including with my fellow panelist Chet in Nepal. And I think that the references to work and descent among the grounds of banned discrimination are often missing. And in many countries, DWD communities are not even recognized as minorities or indigenous peoples, and are therefore not benefiting from the rights granted for these groups. And the normative protection gap has just led to further marginalization and vulnerability of DWD communities. And although the term caste does not appear in any of the international human rights treaties, the practice by UN treaty bodies shows that caste-based discrimination is indeed an international human rights concern and is relevant to their work in many different contexts. IDSN has found that a total of total number of around 84 concluding observations have addressed the issue of caste discrimination in the period of 1991 to 2017. And there has been some real support and recognition to address DWD at many levels of the UN, from the special procedures and mandate holders to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But there is still an incoherence. And despite the practical guidance documents, despite so much of the work that has been done by the Indigenous people and minority section, there is still little evidence of implementation, either within the UN or at the UN country level as well. So where can we start? Because we need to start to seize those opportunities across the UN system. And as the guidance note that we have received highlights, particularly with UN country teams, in particular, also recognizing a non-homogeneous approach. I think that's really important. We're not all the same. We are not homogeneous communities. We are not homogeneous minorities. And we need to put those affected, the minorities, the most vulnerable, front and center. It's of utmost importance to ensure that the narrative and action gives power and agency to the minorities we are protecting. We are not just talking around this issue. And given the global presence, shared experience of stigmatization and discrimination of DWD communities, an existing discouraging experience of single community struggles, I think it would be a really desirable to bring together and unify communities to design and carry out collective efforts at the UN for better visibility, credibility, and to strengthen the necessary legal standard setting and implementation processes. And we also need to link more to the corporate world. We need to think about other players. We need to think about where the protection of minorities and elimination of racial discrimination does have some good examples. And a concept that I think that has emerged, especially in the corporate world, is the diversity, equity, and inclusion principle, which has led to proactive methods to include various underrepresented communities, including minorities, in the workforce. And through this approach in a workplace, co-workers may feel more accepted and belonging, which automatically leads to better retention rates and increased productivity overall. But since DWD communities may be traditionally banned from certain professions and workplaces, and would otherwise feel excluded, it is important to incorporate their situation into relevant diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions, ensure they are being considered when such policies and approaches are designed and applied. I'd also like to pick up on the point around supply chains as raised by Rabia. While most countries have abolished forms of slavery through national legislation and under the monitoring framework of international human rights mechanisms, slavery and slavery-like practices is still a reality for 12 million South Asians who live in different forms of forced labor, especially in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. But there are many relevant initiatives and mechanisms at the UN level that we can be used to gain further visibility to DWD issues and strengthen the rights and positions. Although sometimes UN advocacy may seem distant, lengthy, and in some cases quite abstract, it has proven to be instrumental in raising awareness and finding allies, building networks, and enforcing accountability of duty bearers. So what can be our common agenda? The report by the UN Secretary General titled Our Common Agenda looks ahead to the next 25 years. It states, we will leave no one behind. We are determined to implement the 2030 agenda in full and on time. There is no alternative. The peoples must be at the center of all our efforts. Particular attention must be given to people in vulnerable situations. And secondly, we will place women and girls at the center. Persistent gender inequalities and abuse, including sexual and gender-based violence, have deprived us of a more just and better world. We will accelerate action to achieve gender equality, women's participation, and the empowerment of women and girls in all domains. For us, working on Dalit issues, and for us looking at the protection of minorities, elimination of racial discrimination, please, at the very least, let us start here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mina. There's a couple of questions on the chat asking about whether the recording will be available, and I think we will post it. We were just discussing. Sorry, I was leaning off to the side. I think we will run it on the Minority Rights Group site, so it will be posted there, and then we'll post a link to the to the UN Network on Racial Discrimination and Protection of Minorities website, and so you'll be able to view the recording afterwards, or yeah, in the near term. Laura Kaye, who's sitting next to me, will post that onto the chat, the links onto the chat in a moment. Very interesting, and we will have, I mean, we've had several interventions on dissent-based discrimination. It is definitely a priority to try to move forward on those issues within the broader racial discrimination and protection of minorities band of our work. And I think we will hear further from a number of the participants, including Joshua Castellino, on those questions later in the panel. I would now give the floor to Ghada Al-Harazi from UNICEF, Yemen, to discuss their work on community engagement intervention to empower the Muhammashin communities in informal settlements in Yemen. Ghada, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Do you hear me?
Yes, but we don't
Great.
see you.
I turned on my camera now.
There you are. Yep.
Okay, thanks a lot. Greetings from Yemen, and I am going to share with you UNICEF Yemen experience with addressing the challenges faced by minority groups in Yemen. Al-Akhdam, the servants, the untouchables, the invisibles, the people of the night, or Muhammashin. These are all like terminologies referring to a minority group in Yemen. They consist 10% of the Yemeni population and face the worst kind of discrimination since over 1,000 years. They exist outside of the tribal system due to their blurred and clear origin. The popular belief is that they are descendants of the Abbasian soldiers who occupied Yemen in the 16th century. In a society where social structure is partly based on lineage, their unclear origin has been a main cause of their discrimination. The Yemeni law don't really explicitly discriminate them, but discrimination has permeated the entire system. Muhammashin are subjected to social segregation, which limits their access to employment, education, and basic services and rights. They live in informal slums, do jobs that no other else would do, and many of them rely on begging. Muhammashin have low literacy and formal education. The latest vulnerability assessment showing that 55% of children aged between 6 and 14 years are not enrolled in schools. UNICEF Yemen and its partners introduced the integrated model of social and economic assistance and empowerment to address the complex needs of Muhammashin. The model is implemented through a case management approach where communities are consulted on the effective implementation of services that come in 3 packages or components. Social assistance in the form of humanitarian cash transfer and in-kind support. The second component is provision of social services such as health, nutrition, water, sanitation, education, child protection services, either directly provided to the beneficiaries or referred to be delivered by service providers. Social investment is mainly the community engagement component, which aims at behavior change and providing life professional skills training, employability enhancement, and especially for adolescents and young youth to strengthen and empower local Muhammashin communities. In addition to that, strengthen the Muhammashin community-based organizations to enhance their personnel capacity to claim and access the Muhammashin rights. 58 informal settlements in Sana'a and Amanat al-Asma governorates in Yemen are targeted since the second half of 2019. The outcomes of the 3 components made a tangible impact on the lives of Muhammashin, the most important of which is the behavioral and psychological change in the way Muhammashin think of themselves and the realization of their rights and their capacity to use appropriate channels, skills, and approaches to make their voice heard. Some of the best practices of the community engagement component in the MCA model is the capacity building of adolescents and community members to act as leaders of change in their community and lead initiatives on education, hygiene, financial saving, and others. And the establishment of 102 small community saving funds, because as you know, this minority is one of the most the poor categories in the Yemeni society. In parallel to this, women were trained to in income generation activities such as making incense and accessories, or even like the saving funds helped male members in the Muhammadin to buy motorcycles to be used as transportation means and source of income, or even like they bought livestock for so as to be to better utilize those saving funds. The second best practice is the capacity building of 7 Muhammadin community-based organizations on the technical knowledge and skills needed to assessing the community needs and enhancing, stepping up and improving response to the community, to Muhammadin community. A network of these community-based organizations have been established to strongly advocate for Muhammadin rights and fundraise, participate in the efforts to enroll children in public schools. One of the best outcomes of this component is the development of community engagement system, which mainly introduce the approach of constituting community engagement in other communities. As you know, currently only 2 governorates in Yemen are targeted by the community engagement, and we're hoping to expand above this. We see that community engagement activities and investment on communities, especially adolescents, children, and community-based organizations, as key to our exit strategy for UNICEF and seen as an important sustainability factor. However, as I just said, the project targeted Muhammadin in just 2 governorates, and we have a long way to go to address other Muhammadins scattered in other governorates in Yemen towards their inclusion and integration and realization of their rights. Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you very much. That was extremely interesting. I think it's a credit to how interesting it was that while you were speaking, we actually had an increase in the number of participants, which considering that we're at an hour and a half is yeah, I think people, it really is heartening to hear the UN's work in the field, at community level, and the challenges and the positive outcomes. I hope you'll stay on for the discussion. I think there'll probably be questions. I would hand over now to our colleague Anita Holterhoff from UNODC. UNODC in the network is both the coordinator of the criminal justice pillar of the network, and also takes vigorous part in our intersectionality pillar, which is convened today's meeting. Anika, you have the floor.
Thank you everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I am going to speak to you about a project that UNODC and UN Women did together to enhance access to legal aid in 3 countries in West Africa: Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Senegal. You can find all the things that I mentioned online. I'm not sure if we can share in the chat, but I can share in the Q&A bubble later. This project lasted from 2018 to 2021 and had a very modest budget of less than $700,000 US. And it targeted women that face intersectional discrimination. So first of all, there is discrimination, as you know, that is based on gender stereotypes, stigma, harmful structures, cultural norms, gender-based violence. All of this has an impact on women's ability to gain access to justice on an equal basis with men. And when this discrimination is compounded by factors such as ethnicity, race, indigenous or minority status, socioeconomic status, caste or descent, or urban and rural location, access to justice becomes even more difficult. And also women who are involved in practices that are stigmatized, for example, like prostitution, as well as groups that come from outside of the factors that I just mentioned, like migrant women, displaced persons, women who identify as LGBTIQ, they are all disproportionately criminalized and their access to justice becomes increasingly difficult. And recognizing this, we, in collaboration with OHCHR, UNODC and UN Women, implemented this project to strengthen the capacities of the local stakeholders to provide legal aid services to women. But in addition to all the factors that I mentioned before, we brought in another element of intersectionality that creates further discrimination. We didn't only target victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, who are, let's say, the classic recipients of such assistance, but we also explicitly targeted women in contact with the law as a left-behind group, so alleged or convicted offenders. And of course, we based this on existing instruments such as the Bangkok Rules, the UN Principles and Guidelines on Access to Legal Aid and Criminal Justice, the CEDAW General Recommendation 33, so everything that highlights the problems that women face as alleged or sentenced offenders. And we took into account that many women who become offenders are sometimes previously victimized, or they have no access to the family income to pay for a lawyer and so on. So by identifying that, we really try to embrace as much as possible this concept of leaving no one behind. And when the project closed, we had an independent evaluation that found that we particularly addressed 5 challenges. On the one hand, the lack of training, awareness, and sensitivity to gender and intersectionality issues among the duty bearers, including the legal framework ones, so police officers, judges, prosecutors, courts. Then women didn't know the law, women didn't know their entitlements, nor about the availability of services. And of course, patriarchal structures that meant that women are often not believed when they make complaints regarding gender-based violence, especially when they come from minority groups, especially when they find themselves in rural settings. And even if they are believed, the perpetrators are often not brought to justice because of, well, cultural beliefs, complicated procedures where they need to bring documents that they cannot produce, and so on. Then fourth, the remoteness of courts, where they cannot afford transport to. And 5, the serious challenges to the rule of law in terms of victims complaining and pursuing justice, facing a real threat of violence, physical violence, and have very little protection, as the police are often not motivated or equipped to assist. So there's a great deal of social stigma around this. And what we did was a threefold approach. On the one hand, we looked at changing the legal framework, changing the policy framework. Then we strengthened the capacities of the legal aid providers. And third, we did legal empowerment and advocacy. The project produced a tool in English and French, and that became, during the pandemic and the lockdowns, an e-learning tool. They're both available on the internet. And the independent evaluation concluded that the 2 main results of this project were that, on the one hand, the providers were enabled to deliver significantly more and better sensitive legal aid to women, particularly taking into account all these factors of intersectionality, especially in the remote communities, including by adapting to a very much increased demand during COVID that produced in itself more challenges than before. And we invested in direct practical implementation of the key aspects of the legal aid system, like through advocacy, through preparing the ground, creating locally owned, really bottom-up incentives to further adopt a legal aid framework, but also for the duty bearers. And here, I mean, the government and those people who really can make changes to the system at large, understanding the issue and giving legal aid providers more chances of actually influencing policymaking and implementation. And what we found was that the number and demand of clients increased, and also that the legal aid providers were able to prevent or remedy human rights violations that were not concerning access to legal aid, but they were linked to it. So through getting in touch with these providers, women were able to actually get their rights recognized also in related areas. Thank you.
Super, thank you very much. I see actually we already have some hands on the chat, which is great. If you would like to take the floor and have questions that you'd like to pose to any of the panelists, please do raise your hand so that we can take them in order. But before we go there, we have one more intervention, which is actually where today started with Joshua, who took part in the launch of the guidance note. Joshua Castellino is Executive Director of Minority Rights Group International. And I think he will leave us with the notes that, again, broaden our perspective. So Joshua, you have the floor.
Claude, thank you very much. Really appreciate being here. And I want to just start by, first of all, giving credit to OHCHR's tremendous work with ILO on this issue. You've taken this issue of intersectionality and brought it to life in such practical way that I think it really is a challenge now to all of us in civil society and intergovernmental organizations to really make sure we can implement in a meaningful way. So thank you very much for the leadership you've shown on this. And it's been inspiring to hear our three other panelists and how intersectionality shapes so much of their work. Colleagues, I've said this in an earlier panel today, but I just want to reiterate it because I think it's really fundamental. We are witnessing in the political realm a degree of hate which is dividing our societies and destroying the social fabric within. Intersectionality is an antidote to it. Empathy is an antidote to it. We need to start understanding how we can take real measures to make the fundamental promise of human rights, which is simple. Human rights tries to deliver access to remedies for everybody, that irrespective of their origin, irrespective of any other criteria, that will maintain and promote their inherent dignity and worth. At its very fundamental, it's really simple. At its very fundamental, it has been translated into law through a mechanism of equality and non-discrimination. But let's face it, colleagues, that simply doesn't work. Bland statements saying we are all equal are meaningless if we don't take into account the invisibility and marginalization and structural, issues that dominate our world. So intersectionality must be seen as something of an antidote. Now, we at MRG, this is fundamental to the work that we do. We have three primary goals. The first one is to combat persecution. The second one is to ensure that there's leave no one behind. And the third one is to address issues of climate justice. Now, every one of these challenges can only be addressed through the lens of intersectionality. So we have increasingly found in our 52 years of practice over different places, we currently live in about 60 countries with 31 projects. We have constantly found that if you don't pay attention to the most vulnerable, you simply will not get that objective of protecting rights of all. Now, this is also a challenge, I have to say, internally to minority communities, where discrimination and social structures and patriarchies are also prevalent. So this involves quite a lot of change, both internal and external. But we have found that when you engage on a platform of trying to ensure the inherent dignity and worth of all, in wide context, from Tunisia, work in Tunisia, North Macedonia, Thailand, Kenya, very, very different contexts. This idea of intersectionality can be the only real antidote to being able to ensure that when we articulate the rights of minorities, indigenous peoples, we don't create new victims within those communities who are left behind. And I think that this is really the central message that I'd like to leave this panel with. And that probably, I want to just leave you, I guess, with one test, and then perhaps 4 suggestions on how to deal with the test. So the simple test we've got to ask ourselves is there anything in the identity of an individual that as a consequence of which they are denied access to human rights? It's a very, very simple question. You can look at that answer through data-driven processes. You can look at the extent to which you have life expectancy issues that differentiate it. You can look at the extent to which there's access to health, access to education, access to political participation, voice, targets of hate speech, whatever criteria you want to look at. The first test is there something in the identity of an individual or a community that is forcing them away and marginalizing them? The moment that's the issue, we need to address specific measures to try and address it. The only way you can deal with that is to understand, first of all, your own privilege in addressing the issue, but then to understand what invisibility does, what marginalization does, and what discrimination does. Once you have understood that, it becomes imperative that we then take further steps to realize a vision. And I would suggest 4 simple lessons that we hold true to our work. First of all, look inside, look internally. We all have prejudices of some kind that we have inherited through our education, through the role models we may have followed, through what we think is correct or incorrect or whatever it is. We need to be able to look inside, first of all, and address the biases that may exist in our own practice, in our own approach. There might be things that we're uncomfortable with, but still the fundamental question is, if there is an identity-related issue that is preventing access to human rights, we as people working to create change, to create adequate structures, need to address it. So that's the first one, I guess. The second one is be unafraid to take steps, even when these are challenges to your own personal beliefs. This is very important because very often culture has been used for the longest time as a way to deny legitimacy to certain types of intersectionalities. Women face this all the time. You have this in many, many cultures. Women still do not have equal access to basic factors of production, such as land and finance. If you don't have basic access to factors of production on an equal basis with men, to land and finance, everything else you might do is going to address simply superficial issues and not the underlying issues that keep women subjugated in societies. Now, there might be, culture has often been used as an excuse to prevent this. So we need to look beyond that, and we need to challenge any form of cultural practices that somehow get in the way of the realization of equal rights. And that's tough. That is really, really hard work. This is not easy. This agenda of achieving equality, let's face it, is incredibly hard, and it is incredibly challenging. But if we believe that in the inherent dignity of work, I'd suggest to you it's the only way. The third one is to be able I guess the third one is to be unafraid, be prepared to challenge every mechanism that denies access to justice based on identity. Irrespective of whether we agree with that identity, we are comfortable with that identity, we like that identity or not. It is really fundamental, once again, that this is challenged both within communities, within the interface between a community and a legal system, within the interface with the community, with the majority. Because you're having challenges now in the political space, where minority communities, indigenous communities are facing enhanced challenge. And in the context of that, it's resulting in a level of social fragmentation that is destroying the unity between different marginalized groups. If the women's movement linked in better with the indigenous movement, linked in better with the minority movement, linked in better with the sexual minorities question, linked in better with the urban-rural divide, linked in with all of these issues on the platform of equality and the recognition of inherent dignity and worth, we can make the significant change we wish to see. If we allow ourselves to be fragmented into little silos and argue our own case, then we will essentially get what we have right now, which is a fragmented world where progressives and people who believe in the inherent dignity and worth of individuals are being sidelined by the creation of artificial majorities. So there's a lot at stake here, colleagues. And I would suggest to you the last point really is to work with integrity and work with empathy and realize the fact that the world that we wish to see will not come about by accident. We have to engineer it, and we have to collaborate to achieve it. Intersectionality is an incredible lens. Intersectionality is something that was framed in the women's movement, that brought to the fore by the women's movement, but I think has now got to a stage which has become fundamental. It is making real challenges to how we think about law. It's making real challenges to how we think about invisibility and marginalization. Let's accept those challenges. Let's build on the good practices, many of which you've heard here today. And with special thanks to, again, the ILO and the OHCHR for taking something and putting it together in a guidance note that's both intellectually rigorous and incredibly practical. I think it will be a significant step forward. And I hope we will all be able to join together in addressing that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and I'm so glad we gave you the final word. It really is inspiring, and we really, I think, I at least couldn't agree more with your assessment on the need for solidarity and to come together between different identity communities and movements and to forge common cause. So I hope that the guidance note is an invitation to that as you've presented. I see one hand. I invite the panelists to switch on their screens again, including everyone who presented here, including from the first panel, if you so desire. Madeline Mock is online. I invite you to can she be unmuted? So I think you're going to be unmuted, and you can ask your question. Maybe if you can also introduce yourself. Over to Madeline.
I just unmute myself. I'm Madeline. I'm a long-term human rights defender, and I'm very inspired by all you have talking about women, especially minority. I am a minority, but my situations probably is a little bit different. That I am in a place I'm financially independent. So my situation is a little bit better in terms of getting my own rights. So I am here to learn, to understand the intersectionality of how we can deal with racial discrimination, plus on top of gender, on top of class, which I find it's a little bit hard to wrap my head around, especially when I am looking at different human rights mechanism that is so, in a sense, disjoint when they do their recommendations. So thank you for your sharing. And I don't have a specific question yet because I'm still wrapping my head around this. Thank you.
I think the point is well taken, and I hope some of the panelists will feel comfortable reflecting on it. I notice we also have a question on the chat line from Honorine Ntoyu, and the question is: minority speakers and minority languages are often stigmatized, undervalued, and sidelined in some dominant spaces. What is the role of language within the intersectionality framework toward disrupting deficit thinking and fostering social justice? And I think the question is posed to any of the panelists. I invite one more time if anybody would like to take the floor. I think this will be your last opportunity before we go back to the panel and then close. So I'll just wait to see if there are any further hands or questions on the chat that we should look at. I don't see any, and so I would go back to the panelists to invite you to respond to Madeline's points, which interesting, to the question that was posed on the chat, and if you have any final thoughts and reflections, we can go back to the panel. Shall we go in order? Regina, are you prepared to respond to any of the things? We're working the tech as we speak. Any or final thoughts? I can come back to you if you want a moment. Okay, I go to other panelists. Let's see. Oh, I see Mina. Can I?
Sure.
Right.
I don't know. Well, lots of final thoughts, really. I mean, to Madeline's point, I think one of the things is that, you know, we're all learning every day. It isn't just you. I mean, I'm absorbing a lot of the information that came from my fellow panelists today. I mean, some of the fascinating presentations we had. So, you know, it isn't a thing about just, it is, even though we're deemed experts, I think every expert should agree that they are still learning every day. Otherwise, they lose their relevance and they lose their expertise. So I think, you know, that would be my point to you. And I think, I mean, it's a bit difficult. I wish the special rapporteur was here because we could answer the question about language a lot more effectively than I can, that being his area of expertise. But I also just want to say that for all of us today, I mean, yes, Joshua has expressed his thanks and his appreciation to the ILO and the UN for this amazing guidance note. And I think, you know, much of it was put together by Laura. So I'd really like to pick her out in particular to say thank you to her. It is about empathy, and it is about recognizing privilege. And I think it's really important that, you know, the very fact that we're around this table tends to mean that we're privileged. So I think, you know, and as soon as you're privileged, the tendency probably will be in some way there is that discrimination of somebody else and minority somewhere else. So I just think, you know, we need to be self-aware, and we need to learn every single day. Thank you.
Very good, super. And so I suddenly see an outflowing of further questions, both on the question line and on the and I see a hand on the question line. There's from Celia Zayas Espinosa an agreement about the need to have equal access to resources and the need to challenge all mechanisms that discriminate, including a constant critical revision of our own intersectional privileges. And then she says, my question is, how do we combine intersectional inclusion and creating links and bonds with communities with the inherent dynamism and changes of intersectional discrimination? Then I see agreement from Eva Abugabi on the question of data and the problem of the absence of disaggregated data. And I see another question specifically to Professor Castellino from Maria Victoria Cabrera Ormaza, who says, Joshua, you emphasized on the need to for recognition and respect of different identities. At the same time, ethnicity may have triggered internal conflicts between groups belonging to different ethnic groups, for example, in Rwanda and Sri Lanka. So how to connect the efforts to foster intersectionality and the right to recognition of identity with measures of internal reconciliation among different ethnic groups is her question. And I will give the floor to one more person because I have a hand up, which is Abdi Bilo Ibrahim online with the hand up, and then I will come back to the other panelists. And I apologize to Regina for having terrified her by going back to the first panel. Abdi Bilo Ibrahim, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Are you getting me well?
Yes, very well. Go ahead.
Abdi from Kenya. And question, I don't know whether I'm on the topic, but issue of ethnic or racial profiling by the state are some of the issues that most of the local communities or indigenous communities in Kenya are facing, where the duty bearers themselves cannot be held accountable over their actions or decisions, starting from late 1984, where in particular the Kenyan government has massacred over 5,000 people, raped over thousands and thousands of mothers, and children were born, whereafter all successive regimes were profiling that community by committing communal punishment in case of any crime or incidences of insecurity to death, where those communities, if they opt to travel to other parts of the country, they are yet or still being profiled at this century or this era of the year. And Kenya as a state is bound to protect and promote human rights of the indigenous or that minority communities. What can be done to hold such kind of countries or state accountable for the historical injustice they committed against the minorities or ethnic communities that are very, minority communities? How can you hold them accountable, or how can those communities get reparations? Particularly, women are the most affected, and maybe historically or currently, when it comes to the profiling or harassment from the government forces or security agents, maybe extrajudicial killings, forceful disappearance, gang raping or raped by the security forces. So how can we hold the state to account so that these indigenous communities will no longer be profiled? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I already see one of the panelists requesting the floor to respond. So I give the floor to Anika, and I think we now close the questions and come back to the panel. Anika, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think, yeah, you already referred to some of the questions. I just wanted to say something about the languages, where especially when it comes to access to justice in criminal justice systems with the intersectionality, in some regions there's more done than in others. Speaking about the work that we do, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have worked with indigenous populations where we have included translation into indigenous languages and also adapting the concepts of the delivery of technical assistance, for example, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. And for the question about data, yes, indeed, there is an absence of disaggregated intersectionality of data. And often there is no funding. Also, when you start projects, you should ideally start with a baseline assessment and collect the data, but where there is no funding left, we see that increasingly, if someone takes the time, you can combine data from different sources that are available. For example, if you look for the reporting for target 16.3, the victims that report their victimization, in some countries there is disaggregation by gender and sometimes also by, well, not race or ethnicity, but at least where they live, where they go to the police. As well as other criminal justice statistics. So it is not easy, but increasingly countries understand that they have to disaggregate at least men, women, but they also often do it now in terms of geography. And we advocate that this is done everywhere because some data is anyway collected annually by countries. And I would urge everyone who works with governments, who works with public institutions to really highlight that this is a very easy way to improve statistics, to help do work in this area.
Super. Okay, thank you very much. Joshua, can I give you the floor to respond to the specific question as well as any of the other ones that you may have?
Yes, thank you, Claude. And I want to say that not only has the panel been pretty impressive, we have some pretty impressive participants as well. So thank you for the
Indeed, yeah.
for the challenging questions and the perspectives you've offered. Look, linguistic rights is a major issue too, and this is when you work on minority issues, it always becomes obvious that even when you get to a UN platform, and this touches to a certain extent on Madeline's question as well, you only think about 6 UN languages, and then in the human rights mechanism you only think about 3, and then really we only think about 1. And so there is, of course, for minority communities who struggle with that one language, that UN language, this is almost like a lack of voice. So it is something that it needs to be paid attention to in looking at intersectional discrimination, because if you can't even express your thoughts in the way that you want to, how can you articulate what your demands might be? So this is something that I would call on us to all pay specific attention to. I think, Celia, your question there on how do you make this happen? For me, the answer to that lies in solidarity, and it's really, in a sense, a broader political agenda I would encourage us all to have. And sometimes we as experts are told, oh, but we can't be political. I think we are now at a stage where the personal is political. The women said that a long time ago in the women's movement. We need to really understand the fact that what is at stake is progress. And what is at stake are that progressive elements that believe in the inherent dignity of worth of every individual are being sidelined by others who don't, who believe that the privileged should have a special right. They are the ones who are, in Secretary General's language, these billionaires jetting around in planes. We heard today in the Human Rights Council about how pharmaceutical industries there's 9 new billionaires created from the COVID crisis. So there is this idea there that we need to come together in a fashion that puts aside our differences and unites us. And I think solidarity is crucial, and intersectionality helps with that. And hopefully that's an antidote. To the question on Eva, the data disaggregation, I think my colleague Annika there spoke very eloquently about that. It continues to be a challenge, and the minorities fear it's an even bigger challenge, because sometimes minorities are hidden for a good reason, because they face existential dangers on being identified. And that's a real problem, because if you knew where all a particular community are, that might create a new threat to them, either from government, from police forces, from militia, from others. So this is a very, very sensitive question. But that doesn't mean that because we don't have the data, we can't address the underlying issue. We need to find an in-between situation where we understand through anecdotes, through episodic, through I guess, qualitative indicators, what the issue might be, and we start putting in place mechanisms. Today, there's also an overt reliance on data-driven stuff. So if it's not countable, I'm sorry, we can't deal with it. I'm sitting in a room, I don't know how many cubic meters of air there are, but I know it's enough. I don't think knowing how many cubic meters of air there is would in any way change my experience. Maybe for somebody who's interested in spatial planning, it might. So we need to just get away from this fact that, oh, we can't measure it, so we can't deal with it. I think that's hidden a lot of progress and prevented a lot of progress on issues of gender. So I would just encourage you with that. Maria Victoria, your specific question, you're absolutely right. Sometimes the differences that we identify between ethnic and religious, between religious and sexual, between sexual and linguistic, actually divide us further. And you're right, talking about these issues can sometimes reify divides. But let's just put it in this one particular perspective today, in today's context. We live at a time of scarcity. And the more and more we divide ourselves under these smaller issues, the more and more we fragment our societies. Now, if the discrimination does exist on an ethnic basis, then we need to find a way to combat that. But we need to do it with a realization that more for me doesn't mean less for you. That actually together, you and me, even though I might be an ethnic minority and you might be a religious minority, need to come together to challenge the one thing that is denying us both our rights, which is power. So I think this is really intersectionality is providing us with a language by which we can unite and build solidarities to contest power, not all power, but that amount of power that is denying access to rights. I want to make clear that I'm not suggesting that all power everywhere needs to be challenged, but any power that is involved in the denial of access to human rights needs to be challenged, and it needs to be done through a perspective of empathy and through a perspective of solidarity. And that means overcoming many of these lineages that we've been given that trace back to colonial times, that trace back to dividing one community by saying, but you're left-handed and they are brown-haired. You can't possibly be in the same room. So we need to understand and nuance that too. And intersectionality offers us that lens because it takes away the political elements to it, that you can actually be many things. You don't have to just be, you don't just have to be an activist. You can also be an activist and a scholar and an expert. And you can be a woman too, and you could be disabled too. None of these things are in and of themselves challenges. It's not an either or. And that's a real change that intersectionality provides us. It gives us that understanding that marginalization and invisibilization is often a conglomeration of different factors, not identifiable on just one ground. I trust I've answered most of the questions, Claude, but thank you very much for setting this up. It's been fascinating.
Super. Thank you, Joshua. Gada, do you have a final word for us or want to address any of the questions?
Thank you so much. Addressing discrimination of minority groups is really, it's not an easy task, and it's different from a country to another, from a group to another group. Even it's difficult to do it like a one single approach or system for the one group itself. So I do believe that we have to start from the original point, which is the people themselves. So we have, like in Yemen, marginalized people, they kind of accepted to be inferior to others. And where do you want to start with Muhammadin who feel that they are really inferior and they're happy with it? So intervention and efforts should be tailored to address even like the psychological state the Muhammadin or the minorities live in. And thank you so much, Joshua, for the answers. You have said it all. Thank you, Anika. Thanks to you. That's it from my side. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And having surprised Regina with the possibility to respond, I invite any of the panelists from the first panel, including Rabia, Regina, or anyone else to come in with a brief final word, if you would like. No pressure.
Okay, so after Joshua, I think that I cannot add a lot of things, but I need to point out or highlight what he said about colonialism and how it relates with structural issues. No, the Urban Declaration and Program of Action actually mentions colonialism as the source of racism and racial discrimination. So if we intersect, if we make the intersection between intersectionality and colonialism, we can actually tackle racial discrimination. And yes, we need to always try to advocate and include more and more civil societies and NGOs, because they are creating sometimes the data that we lack or states do not want to create. And expand, yes, try to translate like documents to different languages. I think someone. So after Joshua, I don't know if I could say it better, but that's my closing words.
Thank you very much. Rabia, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you. To address the language part and in general, the interesting questions from the participants, I'll start with saying that Pakistan is an interesting case of multilingual country where the question of language has been the subject of much debate. And Maria and Honorine, I think you are right. I think the real change starts when we are changing the social norms and the unaddressed biases that Joshua also spoke about, that are highly influenced by our backgrounds, our societal stereotypes, and contextualized by our religious and cultural beliefs and practices. So changing this is a hard work. It's not easy, like Joshua said. I would also like to mention that women at home are also responsible for forming disparity, at least in South Asia. It is usually the influence of their parents, and then the cycle continues. So we need to break this cycle. This is the unconscious biasness, and I think intersectionality can really help in bridging that gap. Madeline, you talk about the difficulties you are facing, and it's also very relevant to many in Pakistan. And I would like to share that where there are difficulties, opportunity also arises. For example, your participation and sharing of your experience today at this platform is an excellent example of opportunities where you can raise your voice and be understood. And we have UN and ILO to thank for. So access to such international platforms has helped and empowered me and many others to speak on the issues that are important. And to you, Madeline, and to everyone that have joined today, I encourage you to use these and join these efforts and conversations like you have today. And this can further progress our efforts in breaking the barriers toward a broad-based, job-rich, and gender-responsive recovery where we leave no one behind. Thank you very much.
That is a wonderful note to end on, and really, that was a wonderful series of notes to end on. I think Martin and I will just say brief words of thank you. We owe a huge debt of thanks to all of the panelists and discussants and people who have attended here and raised issues, as well as those who simply attended to listen in. Would very much like to thank Minority Rights Group International for providing us this great platform. Thank you to Laura for her excellent work in drafting this guidance note, and to Martin for really shepherding the process. 2 announcements. I believe we will be endeavoring to have it translated and to do more work to disseminate it also in other languages. If you have a suggestion or a proposal for us for translating it, especially into some of the languages that that we might not start with, please contact us, or please, move ahead. We of course would be most likely starting with UN languages, but there are many more languages in the world. So that is one thing. And then just one other note, that on the 6th of December, we OHCHR will be publishing a guide to developing comprehensive anti-discrimination laws. That is a work done jointly with the Equal Rights Trust in London, and it aims to support anyone who would want to try to strengthen the legal basis in their country on the ban on discrimination, and it includes also chapters on intersectionality. Thank you again to everyone, and I hand over to Martin to close us.
Thank you so much, Claude, and thanks to everybody for this very rich panel. There is really not much one can say in summarizing. All has been said. I think that this seminar was also recorded, and I think we should also look at maybe how we can capture on what you have been saying, how we can maybe elevate some of the messages in appropriate forms. And I just wanted to say, as the facilitator of the intersectionality pillar of the UN Network on Racial Discrimination, that this was certainly an encouragement to this pillar group, which I have listed the agencies, and I have forgotten UNODC, and I apologize for that, because they have been contributing a lot also there in the line. I think we will be coming together also in the coming days and weeks to see how we move forward from that, from all the inspiration, from the examples shared, and to make sure that this guidance note is not ending on the bookshelf, but that it is really, you know, what was said in the morning, and it is a start of a conversation rather than an end of a conversation. And certainly the issue of in translating this note we will be looking at, and we will, you know, be reaching out and making sure that when we have language versions of that, we can share it also widely. The network will continue. There is a website of the UN non-discrimination network that's available also, where we will have future, you know, products that will be coming up. So this is a place where you can check. And you know, let's stay tuned and let's keep in touch on all these important issues. Thank you so much, and we wish all of you, those who have traveled here, safe travels home. Thanks for traveling so far to be with us, and for those who you know, in all parts of the world that are still in the line, thanks for connecting, and we hope to see you again to have a conversation, a continuation of this very, very key and essential conversation. Thank you so much.